Man, I need to tell. Oh, yeah. Okay, so we just recorded this episode and we realized that there's some issue with the audio. So this is the second time we're recording.
So
today we're going to talk about the definition of the cinematic look. Ibrahim and I, we actually have a very long debate about what's the definition of cinematic look. And I'm going to first start off by saying that there's a lot of
confusion,
misconception, I guess, but confusion. And especially, I mean, there's already, between us, there's already not a very strong definition of what exactly cinematic look should be. But from our perspective, certain, let's say amateurs, okay, and there's a lot of people spreading rumors about the fact that just having a very shallow depth of field, having these bokeh means a cinematic look.
Yeah.
Although we don't have a complete agreement on what cinematic look should be, we do have a couple of thoughts on what makes it look cinematic, right? So the first thing that we agreed on, which is having good lighting and good colors.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily need to have these wide aspect ratio, anamorphic lens,
or actually
lens flare,
or actually maybe it does, in accordance to today's cinematic look, because the cinematic look back in the day wasn't wide, but perhaps the cinematic look today is wide, and so maybe from time to time it might differ, and
definitely.
Yeah, I mean, like there are certain elements that come across multiple movies and multiple eras that kind of make a certain footage look cinematic, but there are other elements that actually differ, and therefore the definition might be different, and so we might talk about something that is we might talk about a black and white footage that is shot on a 4:3 aspect ratio. And we would ask the question, like, is this cinematic? Maybe in accordance to today's era, maybe not so much, but in accordance to back in the day, like back in the day's terminology and what was known to be cinematic, maybe it is, right? And maybe what's wide today is not necessarily cinematic. This kind of 2.35 by 1 aspect ratio that is really wide. Maybe in today's day and age, we might think that having this kind of aspect ratio makes the footage look cinematic, or but back in the day the footage was shot mostly on a square format, right? And so there's a lot of confusion, like you said, Kai, and there's a lot of nuance to this topic, right? And so there's no certain definition, but I guess
the thing is that the opposition that we both have against each other. So one is that my standpoint is that it requires context.
Yes.
It requires both story and really good visuals.
Yes.
That makes it that makes it cinematic. But Ibrahim's position is that the look can represent the cinematic look, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah. I think that we can separate the story or segregate the story from the visuals. Right, like, so when we talk about the cinematic look, maybe it needs to have maybe the story is also equally important, but to me it's just the look, it's just what my eyes see.
That's why they call it cinematic look, right, and not cinema.
Yes.
I guess maybe I confused it with purely cinema. Maybe that's my definition of cinema versus just a video.
Yes.
Right. Maybe can. I guess the thing is, I recall clearly when I was watching Tenet last year, I guess, and while I was not watching Tenet in like big screen and all of these action happening, I was like screaming, "Man, this is cinema! This is cinema!" Like like my wife would tell me to shut up, but like I was so I was having these orgasms while watching Tenet. I don't know. Have you watched the movie?
Tenet, I have. Yeah, I have.
Oh,
It is
man,
very
I was
cinematic
like,
as well.
I love it so much. Like when there was this scene where they crossed this rotation machine, and they were seeing each other from the other side of the wall, and they were like fighting against themselves and stuff. There were just a lot of things were happening, and I was like, man, like I keep swearing, the look of it, but mainly the look of it, because Christopher Nolan, he mostly shoots in film. I don't know if he shoots in digital at all, but from what I know, even when he shoots like IMAX movies, it's in film, and it's beautiful. I have to say, like you said, the look is beautiful, man. The colors, everything is like, I'm having I guess the look definitely take a huge part of what consists of a cinematic look.
Yes. And maybe actually emergent is like or storyline is also important as well, you know. But I don't know what's the fine line, but I feel like you mentioned, Kai, before in this episode, like what, like the more that we try to emulate the cinematic look, then the more that we try to emulate cinema, right? So when you think of cinema, like what do we think? We think of like a dark room with a large screen that is I mean, especially in today's era, that has beautiful imagery, immersive sound design, and beautiful colors, you know. Then that is cinematic, right? And the more that you have a photo that looks kind of emulates that, then the more that photo is cinematic in accordance to today's age. Like, is that fair enough?
Yeah, definitely. That's how, because people needs to have a perspective of what cinema is on the first place for them to like say, oh, this is a cinematic look, right? And as you said earlier, in the last episode that got deleted, I did say that like when I talk about cinematic look, in my mind what pops out is like a wet place, like I mean like a rainy place, and it's a lot of colors and it's dark, and then there's like maybe like a cyberpunk city. Like for me, that's the reason why I have this thought is because I watched maybe Matrix, I watched Ghost in the Shell, and to me those are so cinematic, and so anything that I see that look close to that, I consider cinematic look. That's how I get the perspective of a cinematic
and also
look.
Like one thing,
you get it.
And one thing that actually that is common between all the movies that you mentioned, Ghost in the Shell, Blade Runner, or Tenet, is because Matrix is because these movies have their own universe, so they take us out of this world and move us into a new world that doesn't exist right today. So maybe that is also cinematic, right? The more that you create something that is out of the ordinary, the more that you create something that we don't see on a day-to-day basis, right? The more that thing is cinematic. And that's why we go to cinema, right? It's part of it is escapism. We want to see a new world that doesn't exist in our day-to-day world, in our normal life, right? And maybe sometimes we want to see that, and sometimes we don't, you know, and maybe that makes things cinematic, right? That makes it look cinematic, right? It's this kind of unordinary visual that we don't see on a day-to-day basis, you know. And maybe you can have a normal house with a normal family that looks kind of like your house and your family, but the way they are represented, the way that they're living their life in a different way than you're living your normal life, then that makes the movie, which is about that story, cinematic, you know. I don't know if that makes it clear, but I guess it goes back to the idea of like, a different world, right?
I think that's a really good point. Like if you feel like this look has like a world in it, it's like another universe, I don't know, like a parallel a universe in it, then it feels cinematic. Because the thing is, if we just say like good lighting, good color and everything, you can have a very commercial look also. It might not look cinematic, right? Because literally I just shot like a commercial a few months ago, and it's like a family eating around the table, and the lighting, everything, color looks so good, but it just looks so commercial. It looked like something from a TV, right? But it has all the elements. But I feel like what makes it separate from the cinematic look that we're talking about is like what you said, the immersive world in it. If you feel like there's a another world inside this photo, then it's cinematic. Maybe I don't, because the I mentioned earlier the recent photos that you took, it looked really cinematic. The ones that you took on a plane, and there's one that you took on a lake or something. It's very foggy, like really nice color. They're very dark. It just looked like it's another world. It looked like there's a bunch of other people live there and something is happening. There's a story in it, and makes me feel like it's cinematic, right? So I guess it has to do with the look even more. Like I cannot say that people eating around the table and the commercial look is not cinematic. That might be cinematic to some other people's definition, but not to me.
Yes. And I agree with you. I think that the more that this thing that you're showing, the more that this thing that you're displaying is something that we don't see on a day-to-day basis, the more that thing is cinematic, right? Because I still believe that large part of cinema is escapism, right? Like it's going to see something that we don't see on a day-to-day basis, right? Like that's a huge part of cinema, you know? And the more that we can show that to people, the more that what you're showing is cinematic, right? Like, yeah. I think we can agree on that.
I definitely agree on that. And I think I'm gonna have to say, like, to anyone who's listening, if you're a professional filmmaker, whatever we're saying might sound very ignorant, because I don't know, like maybe like these filmmakers from Hollywood or something, they have an even stronger opinion on what a cinematic look is. But I do have to say that I feel like the word cinematic look is being abused by a lot of people. Sure. Like especially YouTubers, like they just have a bunch of B-rolls with shallow depth of field of their laptop, and
some instructors
say,
as well.
It's like Ibrahim instructor. What did he say?
He said that having a shallow depth of field is cinematic, which is like totally wrong.
Yes. But where did that idea even come from though? Why would people say that?
Because I think DSLRs became more accessible, and these these lenses that have a fast aperture became very much accessible, and people start shooting that thinking that their footage looks cinematic. But actually there's a whole different there's a very wide term, and there's a very wide discussion around that. But I don't know actually where it, like, I don't know where it came from.
Right? Where did that come from? Like, there was some weird term from the shallow depth of, like, buttery smooth bokeh. These words, and then there's also like shallow depth of field immediately equals the cinematic look for some reason. But I don't know. Like, but the thing is, it's not wrong either. There are cinema that has shallow depth of field. You know, there's no doubt in it. There's no doubt about it.
Definitely, but it's not. I would say it's not the bokeh. It's everything that comes along with a bokeh, right? And so it's a bokeh is one element, but maybe that's what's visible, right? Like you see a bokeh, but actually it's not just the bokeh. It's everything that is around that bokeh that is making this bokeh look cinematic. You know. I don't know if this is clear, but like you don't see the lighting. Like lighting is very hard to see usually on spot, but that's what actually makes it has made the footage look cinematic. Or maybe the sound design, or maybe the the dressing, the art direction, and all of these things come together. But what you see is the bokeh, you know.
Yeah.
But what's hidden is also as important as the bokeh, you know.
Definitely.
And plus, there are a lot of old movies that have been shot, like Tarkovsky's films, that don't have a lot of bokeh. You know, back in the day, they didn't have these like fancy lenses that are accessible, and so they shot films without depth of field, and they still look cinematic. And they were screaming cinematic. They were shown in cinema. They were shown in, and people enjoyed them. You know, and so yes. It's not one element, it's a lot of different elements, and they all come across they all come together in order to create a cinematic look, you know. And
one thing that we mentioned earlier is that the definition of cinematic look might be shifting and changing throughout the years and throughout time, because when we look back at the beginning of cinema, Charlie Chaplin, black and white, no audio, right? Those cinematic? Those are like the origin of cinema.
Yes.
But why wouldn't we consider those the like cinematic look? I believe it's because of what film we watched affect our definition of that. Because
it's because what we have gotten used to, right? Like, we're not used to watching Charlie Chaplin in today's age. We're used to watching Hollywood movies that are shown in a wide aspect ratio, that have beautiful lighting and colors and all of that, and we have gotten used to this. And so it has been kind of it displayed an image in our mind that what cinematic should look like, what Hollywood creates. There has been a standard that has been set as to what is cinematic in today's age, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with this, maybe.
I think we're going to end a bit earlier today. So before we end, again, I'm going to ask you a question. And what is the most cinematic film that you've ever seen? And I'm going to answer myself first, okay? The most cinematic I've watched is Revenant. And again, like, the reason why I feel like it's like that is I really like the world of it. They use mostly wide angle, like 12 millimeter throughout the whole film, and it's like long shots. That's what made me feel it's cinematic. And what's the film that you find cinematic, the most cinematic, that has the most cinematic look?
I don't think it's but the one that I can recall is 1917, and also some of the classics like Fight Club. I would say they have a lot of cinematic look. Yeah. So something between 90.
And why is it?
Because it has that kind of texture and that grit and that kind of it's just all of these elements that we talked about. It's the lighting, the texture, and the grit, and it just makes me feel like I'm in their world. And it has this color, this pale, like this kind of pale color that kind of immerses me somehow. Yeah.